We're finishing up today our three-part look at the issues in the United Methodist Church that may lead us to a split. And Sally said, by default, we are your speakers this morning to just give you some basic information about how we got to this point and what is happening, and look at two real key organizations involved in this issue, the Wesleyan Covenant Association and then the to be developed Global Methodist Church. We're real glad to have John Carmody available by Zoom, and he's going to talk a little bit about the letter that he wrote to his church, his former church, Cumming United Methodist Church, at the end. And we're glad to have Ferris with us, and hope that as they have things to add, that they will add. What we have read may be outdated, but it's the best we could get on the internet. It's real easy to get down in the weeds when you are talking about the history and the Wesleyan Covenant organization. So I really would urge you to just pick one of these terms and go to the internet and just explore yourself, and you will learn a lot. We want to know, why were they created? How did we get a Wesleyan Covenant Association? How are they going to affect the United Methodist Church? And to me, it's important to have some context, because it didn't just spring up spontaneously out of nothing. So I think the history and the context is real important. We need to remember that within the United Methodist Church for some time, and this has been decades, there had been deep divisions over the way United Methodists think about human sexuality, especially homosexuality. And the focus, so much of the focus, every time General Conference meets, is largely on a sentence that had been added to a paragraph in the discipline in 1972. That's 50 years ago. And here is the paragraph in its original form. Of course, the discipline is the book of rules that the Methodist Church is supposed to follow. So here is the original sentence, or paragraph, excuse me. We affirm that all persons are individuals of sacred worth, created in the image of God. All persons need the ministry of the church in their struggles for human fulfillment, as well as the spiritual and emotional care of a fellowship that enables reconciling relationships with God, with others, and with self. That was the paragraph. And these were the words that were added 50 years ago. The United Methodist Church does not condone the practice of homosexuality and considers this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. So that was added to the discipline 50 years ago. At every general conference, General Conference meets every 4 years. After 1972, this remained a very hot button issue. There was push and pull, sometimes trying to soften the language, sometimes trying to harden the language. For example, 4 years later in 76, the General Conference adopted reports that removed funding of gay, lesbian support groups or any type of education about LGBTQ persons. In 1996, they added a definition of self-avowed practicing homosexuals and a declaration that ceremonies to celebrate homosexual unions not be conducted by United Methodist clergy or in United Methodist churches. In 2012, somebody that a lot of our class will remember, Adam Hamilton and Frank Slaughter, presented a resolution stated that the United Methodist Church agreed to disagree on homosexuality and affirming John Wesley's statement on unity, which is this: though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart, though not of one opinion. Without all doubt, we may. Herein, all the children of God may unite, notwithstanding these small differences. Well, that resolution to just agree to disagree on this point did not pass. And the current language was left as it was with that sentence. Well, by that time, the church, things had reached a boiling point. There was hostility, there was animosity. And at the General Conference in 2016, things ground to a halt. It said they were not even hardly able to do their legislative business. I think this is correct, that bishops do not vote. Is that correct, Ferris? Bishops do not vote. They are sort of there. But at that conference, there was an extraordinary appeal made to the bishops to do something, to step in, else there'd be a split right then and there. So the bishops responded, and they called for the creation of a commission on the way forward that would do a complete examination and possible revision of every paragraph in the Book of Discipline concerning human sexuality and explore options that would help maintain and strengthen the church. Well, the commission, that was approved. The commission was formed. It was authorized. It represented many different views, different parts of the country. I think there were like 32 people or something like that serving on the commission. They formed themselves. They met, they prayed, they tried to inform the Methodist churches what they were doing, what work was taking place. And they could not arrive at a consensus of a single plan to present to General Conference. So they proposed 3 plans, and I think we remember these. So they proposed 3 plans to be considered at a special conference in February of 2019. These were the One Church Plan, the Connectional Conference Plan, and the Traditional Plan. Well, at the time, I think all this wasn't really resonating with us down at the local church. I know it wasn't resonating with me. It was January of 2018 that the fact of this controversy and the potential split over this issue was brought to our attention by Mark Earl, if you remember. He had been following all of this, and he did an excellent presentation to our class about what was happening, and we sort of, got on board with knowing this is something that is going to affect us. It's not just something happening at the General Conference level. So we followed pretty closely through 2018 with the work of the Way Forward Commission, with the plans that were developed. There was maybe a meeting, the DS did a meeting about the plans, presenting what the points of them were. We followed the special conference in 2019, and then the vote, which was to adopt the traditional plan, and it was by a vote of 438 to 384. So it was pretty close. John Cromarty did a presentation for us about what was happening. Scott presented to us a time or two, and Ferris, as I said, followed the developments and kind of kept us up to speed. So what does the traditional plan do? It enhances the current policies on homosexuality and strengthens enforcement. And it approved procedures for local churches to disaffiliate from the denomination and retain their local church property. The traditional plan would impose mandatory penalties for those who do not adhere to church law that prohibits self-avowed practicing homosexuals from serving as clergy and clergy from officiating at same-sex weddings. At this point, after this plan had passed, I remember it with myself, and I think with our class, there was so much anxiety and there was confusion, and it was like, well, what does this mean for our church? Who here in our church wants to leave? Who wants to stay? How do we know who wants to affiliate with Wesleyan Covenant? How will we know what to do? How will it happen? And it felt like we needed to do something at that point to vote, but what do you vote on? So it was really a time of high anxiety. COVID and the postponement of the General Conference in 2020 has allowed for a pause, but not a softening of positions. So we are wondering, and we heard Alice talking about the potential conference at the end of the summer this year. What will happen if the conference is held? What will happen if it is not held? The takeaway from Alice, from me, and Sally and I talked about it, is there's nothing to do now. There's nothing to vote on. Sit tight. There's nothing to do now. Enter at this point then much discussion of the Wesleyan Covenant Association. And for a long time, when I would hear this, I thought, this is a new denomination, but it's not. And Sally's going to talk about what it actually is leading to. The Wesleyan Covenant Association was formed as an association in 2016 of theologically conservative churches. It attracts United Methodists who hold a traditionalist approach to the Christian faith, including strengthening the ban on same-sex unions and ordination of openly gay clergy, and the tightening enforcement of the prohibitions. The revelation of Scripture is the church's primary and final authority on all matters of faith and practice. And you'll see how that differs a little bit from the United Methodist Church. We have found that the Wesleyan Covenant Association is very organized. It is very energetic. Their membership is open not only to churches or conferences, it's open to clergy, laity who share their vision. They have moved very rapidly to create a structure, to adopt bylaws and set up policies. And make no mistake, it is a global association. It is a global connection of local churches, laity, clergy, and regional chapters that seek to partner with like-minded Orthodox Christian to build a new global Methodist church. It was just a few years ago that I realized that there were more Methodist denominations than the United Methodist. I thought if you were Methodist, you were United Methodist. Not so. There are over 30 Methodist denominations in North America. So United Methodist, if you look at the list of them, United Methodist is just way down at the bottom, just one of 30. There's some Free Methodist, there's a Global Methodist, Primitive Methodist, Southern Methodist, and on, over 30. But what they want to do, what the Wesleyan Covenant Association aims to do, is build a new global Methodist church that is theologically conservative. That's kind of where we are at this point. Any questions? We may or may not be able to answer. Any comment, Ferris?
What you were saying about the next meeting of the General Conference, it probably won't meet in August because of COVID travel concerns and the ability of people from Africa and the Far East to get here to the United States. So then the next General Conference would not be until 2024. So that's a long time to think about these things. And it's not something imminent, as Randy Hardy was saying. It's not something imminent that we're going to have to vote next Sunday.
This was interesting. In one article I ran across, I don't even remember which one it was saying that the churches that want to be affiliated with this new denomination are saying they're going to leave anyway. They will leave if the vote is to work out all the rules that permit the disaffiliation, or if it's not. It looks like this is going to happen regardless. So it remains to be seen, doesn't it? Bill.
I didn't realize that Methodist was so much like Baptist. I mean, you know, we got like 90 some odd Baptist groups in the country. I didn't know there were 30 Methodist groups. Where does the United Methodist Church rank? I mean, in terms of size, the United Methodist would be the largest, I'm assuming, in the United States.
I would think, what would you say, Ferris? Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I was just wondering because I had no idea there were 30. I thought there were 3 or 4.
And that's in North America.
Wow.
There are,
and then when you look overseas, Africa and so forth.
exactly. Asia. Yeah, they are many. So, you know, the thinking is, well, if you're not happy with the United Methodist Church, perhaps you could go and affiliate with something that's already established. But the Wesleyan Covenant's vision is to form a new Methodist denomination. And I think Johnny made that same comment to me the other day. Just become a Baptist church.
And Lynda, I think if you remember, Alice had said there were 2 paragraphs about disaffiliation, and one is much simpler if you choose to join one of the other Methodist groups, like if you wanted to be a Free Methodist. That's more, I guess, a lateral move than it would be to disaffiliate. But as we may talk about in a little while, for those churches that choose to disaffiliate, if they wait, and Ferris, you correct me now if I'm wrong on this, if they wait until the protocol, which is another option, is passed, there's a financial benefit to them. They get a certain amount of money to take with them as they disaffiliate. So, you know, that's the carrot out there to wait.
When I looked at this, and like I say, it gets so complicated, we think about the traditional plan as one document, but the way it was treated, and this was by the Judicial Council, which is like the Supreme Court of the church, they looked at each petition, each part of it individually, and there were a number of them, maybe 9 or so, that were in conflict with the Constitution of the church. So that couldn't be part. And then there were like 7 or 8 that were approved. They were supposed to work out the differences with these that did not meet muster. But I think the conference ended before that happened. So there's still a lot of confusion in my mind about the things that have gone to the Judicial Council. And in other words, there's a lot of work yet to be done about it. It's very confusing. Anybody else have a comment or?
This certainly is not helping the schism that is in throughout churches in Europe and other places where the membership is falling and churches are not full and young people are not coming anyway. It's certainly not helping anything, and I wish they'd take that into.
Yeah. One of the things that was interesting to me, ratcheting up on the enforcement of some of the rules within the Methodist Church now, the conferences in the West, California, Oregon, Washington, in a lot of the instances, they just blow off a lot of the prohibitions. In other words, they have been much more open about accepting gay and lesbian unions and gay and lesbian clergy. And in fact, there is a gay bishop who was elected there the last go round, and she serves. So they really push back on that. And so what has happened with the enforcement is someone can bring a charge against a minister that has broken some rule, and there's a court and there's an expensive extended proceeding, and their credentials can be removed. And one of the ones that came to the forefront, if I remember correctly, was a minister who performed a wedding ceremony for his son who was gay, and he was brought up on charges. And so I think a lot of that was, Ferris, was it just sort of put aside for the time being, just kind of like withhold on all of that?
I can't remember. Maybe John does. I can't remember the exact resolution of that.
Yeah.
Now,
But-
that wasn't on the West Coast. I think.
No, I
it
think you're
was-
right.
I
That-
think it was
Mi-
Virginia or North
Midwest or something?
Carolina.
Yeah. No, the West Coast, they've just sort of, want to go their own way. But so this is trying to bring, those churches back into conformity with enforced penalties for not following the rules. Enough police? Kathy says, do they have enough police? Probably not. Yeah. Yes. I tried to get a handle on how many members the Wesleyan Covenant group has at this point, but I kind of couldn't. Like I say, it's churches, individuals, laity, clergy, whomever. I imagine, Ferris, that they would attract people from other denominations who followed that line of thinking and wanted to affiliate. I mean, it is coming out of the Methodist Church. It will be a new Methodist denomination, but I'm guessing it may attract others. I think, and I don't think the question has ever been the acceptance of gay persons into the congregation, but I think a lot of times it's like you're kind of like a second-class citizen is sort of the way I get it. Maybe not able to serve in some leadership positions in some instances, but it's the membership is fine. There's no problem being a member, but anyway.
Really don't know the answer to that, but I do know that, what is it, Presbyterian Church of America, and there were, yes,
Mhm,
yes.
mhm,
And that happened, and that was probably 30 years ago, I guess.
mhm.
And while I have the microphone, I shouldn't say it because I'm brand new, but let me ask you a question. I'm confused about the numbers of the vote. Was that at a conference, the 400 vis-a-vis the 300, or was that this church?
No, that was at General Conference that was held in 2019. That was all the delegates. Worldwide church, yes. Yes.
And weren't a lot of those from churches in Africa that made that difference?
They call those the central conferences, and that was what put the vote over.
Okay. The Global Methodist Church coming up. Thank you, Linda.
Well, first of all, how many of you have heard of the Global Methodist Church? Not everybody. Okay. I think it's real important to understand first off that the Global Methodist Church is not a church yet. It has not been legally formed. It is not operational. And I think best of all, at this point, we could call it a work in progress. As Linda was pointing out, following the General Conference in 2018, the WCA, and I'm rather than saying Wesleyan Covenant Association every time, I'm going to use the acronym WCA. They began working on a book that would provide governance for this newly proposed church and would come into effect once the church is legally formed. And the expectation then was that the protocol, which was one of the options that the General Conference was looking at, the assumption was that the protocol was going to be passed. And that allowed for what they called a gracious exit for churches to withdraw with a financial benefit and their properties. And the more conservative leaders, the WCA, felt that this would result in an exodus of churches immediately once that protocol was passed, and that within a few weeks, they would have their own general conference. The rules of the church would be adopted, and they would be moving forward. Well, as Linda had told you, that didn't happen. And there was no general conference in 2021. Whether we have it in August is yet to be determined. And so most of these disaffiliations have been put on hold. There are some, and Alice and Randy both alluded to that, a lot of smaller churches have maybe not a lot, some smaller churches have disaffiliated. Two in Hancock County, where we're from, have done that, but very small churches, often less than 100 members, have easily disaffiliated because of money issues. Property issues are not as important to them as, say, to a church our size or Mount Bethel, which is in conflict right now. But during this time, the WCA has used what the time they have to further organize and develop what they are calling the Transitional Book of Doctrine and Disciplines. And this is where I've gotten most of the information that I'm going to share with you today. We just call it the discipline. They are calling theirs the Book of Doctrines and Discipline. First of all, the mission statement of the proposed Global Methodist Church. And you'll find that it's very similar to the mission statement of the United Methodist Church. The Global Methodist Church's mission statement is to make disciples of Jesus Christ who worship passionately, love extravagantly, and witness boldly. You may be familiar with the United Methodist Church mission statement. The body of it was adopted in 2000, and it was to make disciples of Jesus. In 2008, the words were added to make disciples of Jesus for the transformation of the world. And that is the mission statement the United Methodist Church is using today. And we're going to look at some of the differences in what we would call discipline of both of the churches. But there are two things that primarily they have in common. And I think this is very interesting. Each denomination, the United Methodist Church, the proposed Global Methodist Church, fear that their witness to the world is being compromised by the current status of the denomination. Think about that. The Global Methodist Church fears that their witness is being compromised by the liberalization of the stance on homosexuality. The United Methodist Church fears that their witness is being compromised by the more orthodox view. So in common, they have their concern about the witness that each is showing to the world. But Each anticipate a revival and a revitalized expression of Methodism after a separation. And I think that goes back to what we were just talking to. The Global Methodist Church may attract a number of people from other denominations that like its orthodoxy, its belief in the inerrancy of the Bible, and the fact that its discipline is very black and white, no shades of gray. And the United Methodist Church would like to live under the big tent where, although we disagree, we can still get along together. And I guess that we'll see. Looking at some of the nuts and bolts in the differences of the denominations, let's look at the role of clergy. In the United Methodist Church, clergy can serve as deacons. Liz is a deacon in our church, as elders, which are your pastors. Jamie and Carolyn are elders, and then local pastors. And I think David Lee would be a good representative of a local pastor, someone who works in the community and pastors usually a smaller church on a full-time or part-time basis. Elders are guaranteed an appointment when they are ordained as elders, and they vow to itinerate, that is, go where called. Deacons, who are referred to as a bridge between the church and the world, are somewhat independent of the appointment process. They can go out and seek jobs on their own, like you would in business or anything else. And local pastors have to be licensed by the church before they can take on their own church. There are very strict education, candidacy, and ordination requirements. Luttrell and I have both served on the Board of Ordained Ministry for the annual conference, and it is a rigorous procedure which any candidate for ministry, including deacons, has to go through, taking a period of years. And as I said, many small rural churches are served well by local pastors that are also part of the Methodist connection. In the proposed Global Methodist Church, all pastors will enter the denomination as candidates for deacons. Elders will emerge through an additional candidacy process. For clergy, there is no mandatory retirement age as they continue to do God's work in his kingdom. And they will have an option of choosing senior status within their annual conference. And I believe, Ferris, and you can tell me if I'm right, in the United Methodist Church, ministers retire at age 72. Is that correct? And that would be different under the proposed global church. There's no procedure for licensing local pastors in the Global Methodist Church. They would come from disaffiliated United Methodist churches, but they have a category they call certified lay ministers. And that's similar in the United Methodist Church to what we call lay servants, certified lay speakers, certified lay ministers, and deaconesses. The United Methodist Church has district and conference committees that deal with all matters of candidacy and licensing. To this point, and I'm going to call it the GMC, the proposed global church, makes no mention of district committees or on ordained ministry, although that could be established later. Their district superintendents will be called presiding elders, and they will serve at the pleasure of the bishop for a specific term. Global Methodist Church bishops serve for defined time limits, and then they are supposed to return to the local church as pastors or in some other areas of service. In the United Methodist Church, bishops are elected for life and continue to serve in that capacity until retirement. And I think as we talked a little bit about the situation at Mount Bethel and last week, and Alice referenced it too, some of the issue there is the overstep of the bishop, and that has come to be an issue that the WCA is promoting in terms of wanting a change, that the overriding administration does not allow for the anonymity that some churches want. Again, Bill, pretty Baptist, sounds like to me. Apportionments. We all know what apportionments are. If you've been a Methodist for any length of time, you know that is the payment that we make toward the annual conference, the general conference. And the thought behind that is that local congregations can pool a portion of their money, and in doing that can accomplish more than any individual church could do on its own, or achieve things that are more effectively done by a larger group. And traditionally, we all knew that apportionments were based on a church's membership. I think Alice and Randy both alluded to the fact that that has changed over the last few years, and apportionments are now based on a church's budget, with larger budget churches paying a larger part of apportionments because of their ability to do so. In the proposed Global Methodist Church, since they will be organized around a smaller denominational structure, the hope is that their apportionments will be smaller, but I assume they will still be paying something toward the administration of the global church. If you remember, both Alice and Randy also mentioned the trust clause, and that is, again, a huge issue in the problems that are going on at Mount Bethel. The United Methodist Church is what is considered a connectional system. And our book of discipline says that this enables us to carry out our mission in unity and strength. And the trust clause is a key aspect of the correctional system. In that, all properties of the United Methodist local churches and other United Methodist agencies or institutions are held in trust for the benefit of the entire denomination and for the ownership and usage of church property. This is all subject to what is written and approved in our discipline. Interestingly, the trust clause has been a historic element of polity in the United Methodist Church since 1797. So the churches being the ownership of the property, the conferences being the ownership of the property is nothing new and part of our heritage as United Methodist. In the proposed global church, local churches will own all their property and assets in perpetuity. Very Baptist. The proposed denomination will, however, assume the liability for the unfunded pension payments of ministers. And in doing so, it may require them to place a lien on the real property of the local church that reflects their fair share of the liability. So those unfunded pension payments to cover the ministers of the church have got to be paid in some way. And if you have broken away, then it's up to your church to finance that, and assuming that a lien on the property would give you those kinds of funds. That's the direction that the global church would go in. Wait just a second. Green light.
Okay, the point you just made, other words, if a church is behind on its present payments, then they have to be made up. That's what you're referring to, right?
Right, and then
Right.
those payments have to continue in some way for ministers to have their pensions.
Right.
And so if your church separates, they still have to pay those unfunded pension requirements. And to do that, you have to find that money some way. And the way that they suggest in their book of discipline is that they would place a lien on the property
Right.
as a loan to do that.
Right. And those monies stay with the United Methodist Church. In other words, they are paid up
Yes,
so that you can leave.
right. And the ministers need to have their pensions available to them, right? And to they would not take them out of the funds at the, level at which they're being invested in the United Methodist Church, is my understanding, John. Thank you. In the proposed Global Methodist Church, the judicial practice and procedure rules play a very prominent part. And of course, that's, as Linda pointed out, one of the reasons we are experiencing as many conflicts as we are today in our denomination. The shift has taken place toward more judicial action on chargeable offenses of clergy who have essentially become conscientious objectors, following their heart, following their conscience in performing same-sex marriages. Some ministers have come out as gay, the district superintendent, and they have actually said, we don't care what the discipline says, we're going to follow our heart and what we believe our conscience tells us to do. In addition to the proposed Global Church's transitional book of doctrines and discipline, they also have a 16-page document of judicial practice and procedure rules to clarify issues of nonconformity and how they will be handled during a transitional process and then beyond at the establishment of the church. The proposed church has a requirement for congregational fidelity that provides for involuntary disaffiliation of congregations that consistently advance doctrines or engage in practices that do not conform with the transitional book of doctrines and disciplines. They also expanded chargeable offenses for laity in the church. In the proposed global church, a professing member of a local church may be charged for promoting or engaging in doctrines or practices that are not in accord with those established by the proposed Global Methodist Church, and for disobedience to the order and discipline of the Global Methodist Church. Currently, the proposed GMC is led and will eventually be governed by a 17-member transitional leadership council that has very broad powers. The team is made up of theologically conservative United Methodists who were tasked with the forming of the proposed global church. Participants include male and female laity, clergy and bishops from Africa, Eurasia, the Philippines, and the United States. Some of you may have heard the name Reverend Keith Boyette. He is head of the Wesleyan Covenant Association and also is heading the council, the Transitional Leadership Council. There is one representative on the council from the state of Georgia. His name is Reverend Jay Hanson, and he is the lead pastor of the Chapel United Methodist Church in Brunswick and also serves the South Georgia Conference as executive director of congregational service. And so I will look at our time. Some of you may have quick comments or questions, but we won't want to go to John Cromarty. I hope all of you read the beautiful letter that he wrote to the church at Cumming that he pastored for many years. And I believe certainly for me and many of us in here, John's letter spoke words that I would love to say, very, very important as another voice to be heard. Eventually that decision may come down to whether we want to be in a big tent with people that we disagree with, but we think we can get along with and show love in our disagreement, or are we going to become a denomination where uniformity over issues like human sexuality is a precondition to belonging or unity within the denomination? And with that, I'm going to ask John to please comment on his letter and maybe open for questions that you might want to direct to him. John?
Yeah, my letter sort of speaks for itself, and you can read it. And if you've got questions about it, a little bit about the context of the letter. In Cumming, we have a couple of Sunday school classes that have sort of led the movement toward a WCA or disaffiliating with the Methodist Church. And so it's a fairly strong movement of a couple of classes that are very strong classes. A lot of good friends of mine are in that group. And it's a very conservative group of folks, and it's a fairly strong movement. And they published they started a website called Concerned Citizens, comingconcern.org was the name of it. And several of the members in the church that would like to keep the church together became concerned that all of the publicity was coming from the WCA reps and none of it was coming from the ordinary people sitting on the pews. And so they approached me about writing a letter to be a part of a website that will come out, I hope, within the next month, that will provide information to the congregation that will essentially argue that we should keep the church together and keep it a Methodist church. But that's sort of the context. That letter has not been published yet, but will be as a part of that new website. A couple of comments. Both of y'all have done an excellent job. I learned a lot myself. One of the problems that the WCA had was at the last general conference, there was a very close vote on this, and we adopted the traditional, what they call the traditional plan. But after that, annual conferences started meeting, and we voted on the general conference that was to follow, the one that was canceled by COVID. And a remarkable number of annual conferences voted for slates of moderate people. The North Georgia Conference was overwhelmingly moderate, especially on the clergy side, but even on the laity side, it leaned towards the moderate side. So there was a decided tilt of the North Georgia Conference toward the moderate position and against the traditionalist view. And that was replicated in a number of places around the country, including annual conferences in Texas and South Carolina and Virginia. So there was a feeling that if the vote were held again on a traditional plan versus a more moderate plan, that the moderates had the votes to reverse that decision to go conservative and instead go toward the moderate position. And I think that dynamic has pushed some of the WCA to move more rapidly to leave the Methodist Church. I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have. As you'll see from the letter, I'm very close to a lot of the members who are wanting to disassociate. Frankly, I was very close to Scott Hearn. We're still very good friends. He's a dear friend of mine. We still are. I don't believe that our differences of opinion about doctrine, and I do believe many of them are opinions. I think self-righteousness about our sureness about doctrine is a dangerous thing. And it chills ran down my spine as I heard about the new judicial procedures in the Global Methodist Church. It sounds like they want to return to the days of the Puritans in New England, which would not be a healthy place from my standpoint. Anyway, I'm happy to answer any questions. You've got my letter, and so you can see where I stand. I'm a big church guy. I don't consider myself a liberal in all of this. I consider myself to be a moderate, and I do treasure all perspectives. I treasure places that welcome differing perspectives. While I was in Cumming, I had several overtures from churches that were very liberal, And I really didn't want to be a part of a church where everybody thought the same way, whether it be conservative or liberal. I enjoy and learn more from a healthy discussion. I think the body of Christ needs to be diverse. And I think the beloved community will be a very diverse community if we ever get there. But I'll open it up to any questions people have for me and then turn it back to Sally and Linda.
John, thank you so much. And we appreciate your input on this and certainly your involvement with Crossties. In closing, does anybody else have anything they wanted to ask?
Let me say one more thing, Sally. We in the local church often take the voting on nominations lightly. We don't attend charge conference, but a lot is at stake on who is on your church council. The voting on the protocol will not necessarily be by 2/3 vote. The church council will have the right under the present protocol to establish whether it's going to be a majority vote or 2/3 vote. That means if your church council is not representative of the entire church, and that includes the silent majority, and I think the silent majority in Gainesville First and Cumming decidedly would like to stay with a bigger tent. But if you let the church council be dominated by one side or the other, it's going to dictate whether you go the majority or the 2/3 route. And don't let that get out of sight as that process continues to take place. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That is a very important point because, we don't know if or when a vote is coming, but when it does, we certainly want all voices to be represented. So thank you so much. Let me remind you about our next 2 Sundays. We're so pleased that Reverend, we always said Jimmy Cantrell. I think now he goes by Jim Cantrell. Dr. Jim Cantrell is going to be with us. Wonderful associate minister that came through Gainesville, and I know some remember him very fondly. He has asked for our questions, as I said in my email. So please, let's give him some questions. And he said, nothing is out of line. Ask whatever you would like. You can send directly to him. You can send to me and I will forward to him. But he wants to incorporate our concerns and issues into his program. I think we'll certainly want a good crowd here to be with him, and we'll enjoy seeing him again and to hear what he has to say. In closing, I want to share a scripture that I came across in some of my reading. It's Ephesians 3:10. God's purpose is now to show the rulers and powers in the heavens the many different varieties of his wisdom through the church. And with that, I'll close. Wish you a good week and a healthy week, and we'll see you next Sunday. Thank you.